In the beginning, there was a different kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of terrible knowledge, not yet, but the loneliness of a child who could never quite belong. A boy born in 1904 into a luxurious Manhattan apartment, surrounded by art and culture and refined conversation, yet somehow always standing apart, always watching from behind an invisible wall. Robert Oppenheimer's isolation began not with the atomic bomb, but with his birth into a world that could not decide what he was. His family were German Jews, but not like other Jews. They had shed their traditions, abandoned the Yiddish language, embraced the secular ethical culture society, with its American ideals and moral stringency. They were caught between worlds, too Jewish for Gentile society, too assimilated for the Orthodox community. This was the world of German Jewish immigration to America, shaped by the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and by Reform Judaism's promise that assimilation would bring acceptance and equality. They believed, these German Jews, that if they abandoned their distinct cultural traits, if they became American enough, refined enough, educated enough, they would finally be welcomed. But the promise was a lie, or at least only half true. The Seligman affair had shown them this. German Jews barred from elite hotels and clubs despite their wealth and cultivation. The invisible walls remain, no matter how much they tried to erase their differences. Oppenheimer's father, Julius, embodied the struggle completely. He had worked so carefully to shed his German accent, to erase any trace of his origins, to fit himself into American gentility, like a man reshaping his own bones. He was well educated, a successful businessman, but beneath the success was the constant effort of becoming someone else, of hiding who he had been. And what did this teach his son? That identity was something to be ashamed of, something to be concealed, something that made you vulnerable. His mother, Ella, came from a similar German Jewish background, but she was more Americanized, more cultured in the way that American society recognized and valued. She raised Robert in an environment that was ethically stringent, sheltered, refined to the point of suffocation. She wanted to protect him from what she called the cruel and bitter things, from coarseness, from the pollution of the outside world. And so she created a hothouse child, a boy who was described by those who knew him as unctuous, as repulsively good, as strange in ways that other children instinctively recognized and rejected. The apartment in Manhattan was luxurious, filled with beautiful things, art on the walls, books lining the shelves, conversations about literature and philosophy floating through the rooms. But luxury is not the same as warmth, and refinement is not the same as connection. Robert grew up surrounded by culture, but starved for companionship. His intellectual precocity was encouraged, celebrated even. He loved art and literature and architecture. He collected minerals with a passion that might have seemed eccentric in another child, but was seen as merely another sign of his gifts. But where were the friends? Where were the normal childhood experiences of play and roughhousing, and the casual intimacies that teach children how to be with other people? He had almost no one. His younger brother Frank was born when Robert was 8 years old, and perhaps under different circumstances, this might have created a bond, a companion in the isolation. But the shadow of an earlier infant brother's death hung over the family atmosphere, like a fog that never lifted. Grief and fear, and the desperate protectiveness of parents who had already lost one child. These shaped the household in ways that made genuine connection difficult. The ethical culture school, where Robert received his education, was an institution founded by Felix Adler, with very specific goals. It combined rigorous academics with a strong emphasis on American ideals, on patriotism, on ethical behavior, divorce from religious creed. The motto might as well have been, be good, be American, and forget where you came from. For a boy like Robert, already confused about his identity, already uncertain where he belonged. This education reinforced the message that his Jewishness was something to transcend, not something to embrace. He excelled academically, of course. His mind was extraordinary, moving faster than his teachers could follow, making connections that left his classmates baffled. But his social skills lagged so far behind his intellectual abilities that he seemed almost like two different people. The brilliant student who could master any subject, and the awkward boy who could not navigate the simple social dynamics of childhood friendship. He found one kindred spirit in these years, Francis Ferguson, a Gentile boy from New Mexico's elite. The friendship mattered enormously to Robert, perhaps more than Ferguson ever knew. Here was someone who shared his interests, who could talk about ideas and art and literature, who did not seem to find him strange or off-putting. But even this friendship highlighted how few such connections he could make. One friend. In all of childhood, essentially one friend. The First World War came when Robert was still in school, and it divided the ethical culture community in ways that must have been confusing for a young boy trying to understand where he fit. Some members supported American entry into the war, seeing it as a patriotic duty. Others, remembering their German origins, felt torn or opposed. The community that was supposed to provide moral clarity instead revealed itself to be as confused and conflicted as the larger society. And Robert, watching this, grew increasingly distant from the movement, increasingly critical of his father, developing a complexity of personality that would mark him for life. Then came the summer of 1918, and with it, an experience that would scar him permanently. A summer camp. It should have been unremarkable. A chance for a 14-year-old boy to spend time outdoors, to make friends, to have adventures. Instead, it became a nightmare of bullying and social rejection. The other boys sensed something in him, something different, something they could not articulate but instinctively attacked. Perhaps it was his intellectualism, his lack of physical prowess, his mannerisms shaped by his sheltered upbringing. Perhaps it was simply that children can be cruel, and Robert was an easy target. He returned from that summer carrying wounds that would never fully heal. The experience confirmed what he perhaps already suspected, that he would always be the outsider, that other people would always find him strange, that belonging was something that happened to other people, but not to him. He turned to literature for solace and found in George Eliot's Middlemarch a character he could identify with completely. Tertius Lydgate, the brilliant, passionate outsider, who could never quite find his place in the provincial society that surrounded him. Lydgate's tragedy, his intellectual gifts wasted, his ideals compromised, his life ultimately a disappointment, must have resonated with something in Robert's soul. This was his first isolation, the loneliness of not belonging, of being fundamentally different in ways he could not change or hide. The loneliness of a mind that worked differently, that saw connections others missed, that needed intellectual stimulation others could not provide. The loneliness of a Jewish boy in a family that wanted to forget it was Jewish, in a society that would never let them forget, caught between identities with no clear place to stand. And beneath all of this, developing slowly but inexorably, was a fragile sense of self. Who was Robert Oppenheimer? Was he American or German? Was he Jewish, or was he simply ethical, secular, modern? Was he the brilliant student his teachers praised, or the strange, repulsive boy his classmates mocked? He did not know, and not knowing who you are is perhaps the deepest loneliness of all, because it means you are isolated even from yourself. But then, briefly, startlingly, there was light. In 1922, at 18 years old, Robert Oppenheimer traveled to New Mexico, and something inside him that had been dormant something he might not have known he possessed, suddenly awakened. For the first time in his life, he experienced what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to be welcomed, to find a place where his strangeness was not a burden, but simply part of who he was. New Mexico in the 1920s was a different world from Manhattan. The landscape alone, vast and open, all that space stretching to distant mountains under skies so big they seemed to swallow you, must have been overwhelming for a boy raised in the confined elegance of a city apartment. But it was more than the landscape. It was the people, the social milieu he found there among Gentiles with deep ties to the American frontier and its pioneering spirit. These were people with a different kind of confidence, a different kind of identity. They knew who they were. They belonged to this place in a way that Robert had never belonged anywhere. Francis Ferguson was there, his old friend from the ethical culture school, and through him Robert met Paul Horgan and others, young men with wide-ranging interests who shared his love of ideas and art and conversation, but who also knew how to ride horses and survive in the wilderness and move through the world with an ease Robert had never mastered. They accepted him. They saw his brilliance not as something threatening or strange, but as interesting, as valuable. They made space for him in their group, in their adventures. The New Mexican landscape itself became a refuge. There was something about the desert, about the mountains, about the quality of light and the silence of vast, empty spaces that spoke to something deep in Robert's nature. Perhaps it was the way the landscape made no demands on him, accepted him without judgment, offered a kind of peace that human society never had. He fell in love with it completely. This would become his spiritual home, the place he would return to, again and again throughout his life, the place where he felt most himself. And then there was Catherine Chavez Page. She was from an aristocratic Hispanic family, with a proud history reaching back generations in New Mexico. She represented something Robert had never encountered before, a kind of rootedness, a clear and unambiguous identity, a connection to place and history that must have seemed almost magical to someone who had spent his whole life uncertain of where he came from or where he belonged. He fell in love with her, that unrequited love that marked so many of his early romantic attachments, and the fact that she did not return his feelings somehow did not diminish the importance of the experience. Because he had felt something, he had wanted something, he had imagined, however briefly, that he might be the kind of person who could love and be loved, who could build a life connected to other people rather than always standing apart. He learned to ride horses during this time, throwing himself into it with the intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him. It must have been both thrilling and terrifying. This physical activity, this test of courage and skill that had nothing to do with intellectual ability. On horseback in the mountains, he was forced to trust his body, to react instinctively, to exist in the moment rather than in his head. It was a kind of freedom he had never known. The summer passed too quickly, as summers do when you are happy. Robert made other friends, discovered an interest in girls that marked a departure from his previous social isolation. He went to dances, engaged in flirtations, experienced the awkward joy of adolescent romance. For a few months he was almost normal, almost like the other young men his age, almost free of the burden of his strangeness. But nothing lasts forever. The summer ended, and he returned to New York, and the contrast must have been devastating. Back in the city, back in his family's apartment, with its refined culture and its invisible tensions, he felt the isolation more keenly than before, because now he knew what it felt like to almost escape it. Now he had tasted belonging, and its absence was no longer something he had never known. It was something he had lost. He carried New Mexico with him, though. It became his refuge in memory, even when he could not be there, physically. He wrote letters to his friends there, tried to maintain the connections he had made, and he promised himself that he would return, that this place that had welcomed him would be part of his life forever. It was a promise he would keep, though in ways he could not have imagined in 1922. The experience of New Mexico did something crucial for Robert. It showed him that belonging was possible, that there were places and people that could accept him as he was. This knowledge would sustain him through the difficult years ahead. But it also made his isolation when he was away from New Mexico more painful, because now it was a choice as much as a circumstance. He had found a place where he fit, but his education, his career, his life were pulling him away from it. There is a particular kind of loneliness in knowing that the place where you belong is not the place where you must be. In knowing that you have found your home, but your home is somewhere you can only visit, not somewhere you can live. Robert felt this tension acutely. New Mexico offered him peace and acceptance and a sense of connection to something larger than himself. But his destiny lay elsewhere, in universities and laboratories, in the world of physics and mathematics that was calling to him with increasing urgency. So he held New Mexico in his heart as a kind of talisman, a reminder that he was not fundamentally incapable of belonging, that his strangeness was not absolute. Somewhere there was a place that wanted him. Somewhere there were people who saw him clearly and did not turn away. This knowledge would matter enormously in the years to come, when the isolation deepened and the burdens grew heavier. He could always remember that summer in 1922, when, for a brief and shining moment, he had been happy. Harvard came next, in the fall of 1922, the same year as his New Mexican awakening. It was a time of controversy over Jewish quotas, those carefully maintained but rarely discussed limits on how many Jewish students could be admitted to elite universities. The quotas were defended, when they were defended at all, with euphemisms about maintaining diversity and ensuring proper social balance. But everyone understood what they really meant. There were too many brilliant Jewish students, and if merit alone determined admission, there would be even more. So invisible walls were erected, carefully calibrated to keep the numbers manageable. Robert Oppenheimer was admitted despite these quotas, or perhaps because his family's wealth and assimilation made him more acceptable than other Jewish applicants. Either way, he must have been aware from the beginning that his presence at Harvard was in some sense provisional, that he was there on sufferance, that others like him had been excluded to make room for him. This knowledge does something to a person. It makes you aware that you are being judged, not just as an individual, but as a representative of your group, that your success or failure reflects on others who will come after you. He arrived intending to major in chemistry, but his interest shifted almost immediately to physics. Something about physics called to him, perhaps the way it reduced the complexity of the world to fundamental principles, perhaps the elegance of its mathematics, perhaps simply that it was the most difficult and abstract of the sciences, and therefore the most worthy of his abilities. He threw himself into it with characteristic intensity, studying graduate-level courses while still an undergraduate, impressing his professors with the speed of his comprehension and the originality of his thinking. But academic success did not translate to social ease. His circle of friends remained small, largely Jewish or from similar backgrounds. Frederick Bernheim and William Boyd, young men who understood something of what it meant to be brilliant and Jewish, and never quite comfortable in the Gentile world of Harvard. With them, he could relax slightly, could be himself, without constantly monitoring how he was perceived. But even these friendships had their limits. Robert's mind moved so quickly, ranged so widely, that even his closest friends sometimes struggled to keep up with him. His interests extended far beyond science. He read voraciously, literature, philosophy, poetry, in multiple languages. He was particularly drawn to the French symbolists, to Dante, to the Sanskrit classics. He tried his hand at writing short stories, perhaps hoping that creative writing might be a way to understand human nature, to bridge the gap between his inner world and the outer world of other people. He showed his stories to his friends, hoping for encouragement or at least constructive criticism. Instead, he received harsh judgment. His stories were pretentious, overwrought, too intellectual, lacking in genuine human feeling. The criticism cut deep, perhaps because it touched on his fundamental insecurity, that for all his intellectual gifts, he did not really understand other people, could not capture in words the emotional truths that seemed to come naturally to real writers. He abandoned creative writing after this, turning back to physics and mathematics where his abilities were unquestionable. But the desire to understand human nature, to connect with others through art and ideas, remained. He continued to read literature, to engage with philosophy, to seek in books what he could not find in life. There is something poignant about this, a young man so brilliant, so capable of understanding the fundamental structure of reality, yet baffled by the much simpler question of how to relate to other people, how to make friends, how to love and be loved. His passion for physics grew exponentially during his Harvard years. He began to realize that this was not just another subject he was good at, but his true calling, the thing he was meant to do with his life. The elegance of quantum mechanics, which was just beginning to revolutionize physics in the mid-1920s, captivated him completely. Here was a field that required not just mathematical ability, but genuine imagination. The ability to think beyond classical intuitions about how the world worked. Here was a field where his particular combination of brilliance and creativity could flourish. In the summer of 1925, he traveled to Europe, and the experience was transformative. In Cambridge, England, he encountered the center of the quantum revolution. He met physicists who were reshaping humanity's understanding of reality. Paul Dirac, Wolfgang Pauli, others whose names would become legendary. And for the first time, he found himself among people who could not only follow his thoughts, but push back, challenge him, force him to think more deeply and carefully. It was exhilarating and humbling at the same time. He returned to Harvard in the fall of 1925 with a renewed sense of intellectual confidence, but also an elevated sense of his own abilities that bordered on arrogance. He knew now that he could compete with the best physicists in the world, that his mind was extraordinary, even among the extraordinary. This knowledge was both empowering and isolating. It widened the gap between him and his peers, made him even more impatient with those who could not think as quickly or as abstractly as he did. His time at Harvard was marked by this tension, intense intellectual activity, combined with social awkwardness and emotional isolation. He worked ceaselessly, driving himself to master not just the required curriculum, but everything he could find about modern physics. He was deeply homesick, missing New Mexico, missing the sense of connection he had felt there. He was anxious about his future, uncertain where his path would lead, aware that his brilliance was not enough to guarantee success in a world that judged him for more than his intellect. And he was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely, in ways that his intellectual achievements could not assuage. He had acquaintances, but few real friends. He had no romantic relationships, no sense that he was capable of inspiring love in others. He watched his classmates fall in love, form bonds, build the social networks that would sustain them throughout their lives. And he felt himself to be fundamentally separate from all of that. His mind could grasp the most abstract concepts in physics, could follow mathematical arguments that left others bewildered, but he could not grasp the simple human art of connection. This was the loneliness of brilliance, the isolation that comes from being able to see further, think deeper, understand more clearly than those around you. It sounds like it should be a blessing, and in some ways it was. His abilities would open doors, create opportunities, eventually place him at the center of one of history's most significant projects. But it was also a curse because it separated him from the ordinary human experience of being understood, of being met where you are, of having someone look at you and truly see you, without bewilderment or intimidation or resentment. At Harvard, surrounded by some of the brightest students in America, Robert Oppenheimer was utterly alone, and he was beginning to understand that this might be the price of his gifts, that the very qualities that made him exceptional also made him fundamentally isolated. It was a realization he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In 1926, Robert Oppenheimer arrived in Göttingen, Germany, as a doctoral student under Max Born. It should have been paradise for someone like him. Finally, a place where his intellectual abilities would be not just recognized but expected, where he would be surrounded by the greatest minds in physics, where the conversations would match the speed and depth of his thinking. And in many ways it was paradise. But paradise, as we learn again and again, can also be a form of exile. Göttingen in 1926 was at the absolute center of the quantum revolution. This was where the new physics was being invented, where young geniuses were tearing down centuries of classical certainty and replacing it with something strange and probabilistic and profoundly counterintuitive. Heisenberg had just developed his matrix mechanics. Schrödinger's wave mechanics was revolutionizing how physicists thought about atomic structure. The mathematical formalism was being worked out in real time, with implications that nobody fully understood yet. It was an incredibly exciting time to be a physicist, and Oppenheimer had positioned himself at the very heart of it. Max Born was an excellent advisor, rigorous, demanding, willing to give his students considerable freedom, while also providing structure and guidance when needed. He was immediately impressed by Oppenheimer's abilities, by the speed with which he grasped new concepts and the originality of his insights. But Born was also frustrated by certain aspects of his new student's personality. There was an arrogance to Oppenheimer, a tendency to show off his knowledge, to interrupt others, to make it clear that he thought faster and understood better than his colleagues. This did not endear him to the other students or to the faculty. The arrogance was partly a defense mechanism, of course. Oppenheimer had learned early that his intellect was his most valuable asset, the thing that made him worthy of respect, even if he could not inspire affection. And in Göttingen, surrounded by extraordinarily talented physicists, he felt compelled to prove constantly that he belonged among them, that he was not just adequate, but exceptional. But there is a fine line between confidence and arrogance, and Oppenheimer crossed it regularly. He also struggled with discipline in his work. His mind ranged so widely, was interested in so many different problems, that he sometimes had trouble focusing on a single project long enough to bring it to completion. Born had to rein him in repeatedly, forcing him to concentrate on his doctoral thesis, rather than chasing every interesting idea that caught his attention. It was a pattern that would persist throughout his career, brilliant insights scattered across multiple fields, but sometimes lacking the sustained focus that produces truly great work. Despite these tensions, Oppenheimer quickly established himself among the leading young quantum physicists. He produced his doctoral thesis on the quantum theory of continuous spectra, an important contribution to the emerging field of quantum chemistry. The work demonstrated his ability to move between abstract theory and concrete physical problems, to apply the new quantum formalism to real systems, It was solid, impressive work that earned him his doctorate and established his reputation. But Göttingen was not just an intellectual environment, it was also a political one, and the politics were becoming increasingly toxic. This was Germany in the mid-1920s, a country still traumatized by its defeat in World War I, struggling with economic instability, watching the rise of nationalist and anti-Semitic movements. The Nazi Party was still relatively small in 1926, but the atmosphere of resentment and scapegoating was already pervasive. And Oppenheimer, despite his family's assimilation, despite his American citizenship, was identifiable as a Jew. The anti-Semitism was often subtle, expressed in glances and exclusions rather than open hostility. But it was there, a constant background radiation that reminded him that he did not truly belong. The same dynamic he had experienced in America, being brilliant enough to be valuable but Jewish enough to be suspect, played out in Germany as well. He was welcomed for his abilities, but never quite accepted as simply another member of the physics community. His most important encounter during this period came when he met Niels Bohr at Cambridge in 1926. Bohr was already a legendary figure, the elder statesman of quantum physics, and his philosophical approach to the subject, his emphasis on complementarity, on the limits of classical concepts, on the role of measurement and observation, profoundly influenced Oppenheimer's thinking. More than that, Bohr represented a different kind of physicist than Born or Heisenberg or the others. He was deeply thoughtful about the philosophical implications of physics, about what quantum mechanics meant for our understanding of reality. This combination of technical brilliance and philosophical depth was exactly what Oppenheimer aspired to. The meeting with Bohr was a turning point. It confirmed for Oppenheimer that theoretical physics was not just about solving equations, but about understanding the nature of reality in the deepest sense. It motivated him to pursue physics more seriously, to commit himself fully to the field, rather than hedging his bets or maintaining his amateur interest in literature and philosophy. He could be a physicist who also cared about philosophy, who read poetry and thought about meaning and purpose. He did not have to choose between the different parts of himself. His time at Göttingen was also marked by important friendships with other young physicists. Paul Dirac, in particular, became someone he admired enormously. Dirac was in some ways Oppenheimer's opposite, socially awkward to the point of appearing autistic, completely uninterested in anything outside of physics and mathematics, but with a technical brilliance and mathematical elegance that Oppenheimer envied. Dirac could take a complicated problem and reduce it to its essential elements, could find the simplest mathematical formulation that captured the physics perfectly. Oppenheimer tried to emulate this, but his mind did not naturally work that way. He was more discursive, more interested in connections between different areas, less focused on technical perfection. But even among these brilliant physicists, even in this environment where his abilities were recognized and valued, Oppenheimer remained somehow apart. Partly this was his personality, the arrogance, the showing off, the tendency to interrupt and dominate conversations. Partly it was his Jewishness in an increasingly anti-Semitic environment. Partly it was simply that he wanted more from human relationships than intellectual exchange, wanted friendship and warmth and connection, but did not know how to create those things. He returned to the United States in 1927, having earned his doctorate and established himself as a rising star in theoretical physics. He took a National Research Council fellowship that allowed him to work at Harvard and then at Caltech, where he would begin to build his own school of theoretical physics. He was 23 years old, extraordinarily accomplished, and still profoundly lonely. The loneliness was different now, though. It was no longer the loneliness of feeling intellectually isolated, of having thoughts and interests that nobody around him shared. He had found his intellectual home, had proven that he could compete with the best physicists in the world. But this only made the other kind of loneliness more acute, the loneliness of having no real, intimate connections, no romantic relationships, no sense that anyone truly knew him beyond his brilliant mind. He was beginning to build something, though. He was beginning to imagine creating in America what he had experienced in Göttingen, a community of physicists working at the highest level, pushing the boundaries of what was known, training the next generation of scientists. This would become his great project in the 1930s, and for a while, it would provide a sense of purpose and connection that eased his isolation. But it would also prepare him, though he did not know it yet, for an even greater responsibility and an even more profound loneliness. The 1930s were Oppenheimer's golden years, the period when he came into his own as a physicist and as a leader. He established himself at Berkeley and Caltech, splitting his time between the two institutions, and began to attract the best young physicists in America to work with him. He was building an American school of theoretical physics, creating something that had not existed before, a homegrown tradition of excellence that could rival the great European centers, like Göttingen and Cambridge. His teaching style was demanding, often intimidating. He expected his students to keep up with him as his mind leaped from one topic to another, making connections that seemed obvious to him but required considerable effort for others to follow. He could be impatient with those who were slower, dismissive of questions he considered elementary. Some students found him inspiring, a brilliant mind who pushed them to exceed what they thought they were capable of. Others found him arrogant and off-putting, more interested in displaying his own knowledge than in genuinely helping them learn. But there was no question that he was effective. The students who thrived under his mentorship went on to become leaders in their fields. Julian Schwinger, who would share the Nobel Prize for his work on quantum electrodynamics. Richard Feynman, whose path-integral formulation of quantum mechanics would revolutionize the field. Hans Bethe, Willis Lamb, Robert Serber. The list of accomplished physicists who studied with Oppenheimer or were influenced by him is extraordinary. What was his secret? Partly it was his sheer intellectual range. He was interested in everything: particle physics, nuclear physics, astrophysics, quantum chemistry. He could move between fields with ease, seeing connections that specialists missed. When a student came to him with a problem, he could often suggest an approach from a completely different area of physics that turned out to be illuminating. This breadth made him an invaluable mentor for young physicists who were still trying to figure out what they wanted to work on. But it was also his personal charisma, his intellectual passion, the sense he conveyed that physics was not just a career, but a calling, a way of understanding the deepest truths about the universe. He made physics seem important, even noble. He made his students feel that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their work mattered in profound ways. This ability to inspire, to make others believe in the significance of what they were doing, would later be crucial to the success of the Manhattan Project. His own research during this period was wide-ranging, but sometimes lacked focus. He made important contributions to several fields: work on cosmic rays, on quantum electrodynamics, on nuclear physics. But he never concentrated on a single problem, long enough to produce the kind of breakthrough that would have won him a Nobel Prize. There was a mathematical sloppiness to some of his work that frustrated his colleagues. He was brilliant at seeing the essential physics, at understanding what was important, but less careful about the details of calculation. He would make mistakes in his mathematics, then correct them almost instinctively, arriving at the right answer by a kind of physical intuition rather than rigorous calculation. This drove more careful physicists crazy. They wanted to know, how did he know the answer was right if his mathematics was wrong? But Oppenheimer seemed to have an almost mystical sense of how the physics should work, and more often than not, his instincts were correct. Still, it meant that his reputation was mixed. Everyone acknowledged his brilliance, but there were questions about whether he would ever produce truly great work. During this period, his political views began to shift dramatically. The Great Depression had thrown millions of Americans into poverty, and Oppenheimer became increasingly aware of economic injustice and social inequality. The rise of fascism in Europe, particularly Hitler's rise to power in Germany, and the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, radicalized him further. He began associating with left-wing groups, attending meetings, contributing money to various causes. He was drawn to Communist Front organizations, though he consistently denied ever joining the Communist Party itself. His younger brother Frank was more openly involved in communist politics, which created both a bond and a source of tension between them. Frank had followed Robert to Caltech, had become a physicist himself, but his political commitments were deeper and less ambiguous. This would later cause problems for both brothers, as their communist associations attracted FBI surveillance and suspicion from military and political leaders. But for Oppenheimer, the political activity seemed to be partly an attempt to connect with something larger than himself, to be part of a movement that was trying to make the world better. The loneliness of his childhood and young adulthood had been partly a loneliness of purpose. What was the point of his brilliance if it served nothing beyond his own advancement? The left-wing politics of the 1930s offered a vision of science and service, of social justice, of intellectual work that could actually improve people's lives. It was appealing in ways that pure research could never be. He also began to have romantic relationships during this period, though they were often complicated and unhappy. He seemed drawn to women who were themselves troubled or unavailable, and his relationships tended to be intense and destructive. He had affairs with students' wives, with women who were involved with other men, creating drama and pain for everyone involved. It was as though he did not know how to have a normal, healthy relationship, as though the emotional skills that would have made such relationships possible had never developed in him. In the late 1930s, he met Jean Tatlock, a psychiatrist and member of the Communist Party, and fell deeply in love with her. She was brilliant, troubled, beautiful in a way that captivated him, but she was also deeply ambivalent about the relationship, breaking up with him and reconciling repeatedly. She struggled with depression, with uncertainty about her sexuality, with demons he could not understand or help with. Their relationship became a source of both joy and anguish for him. Eventually they broke up for good, and he married Catherine "Kitty" Puning Harrison, a woman with her own complicated past and radical political connections. But his most important work during this period was not his research or his personal life. It was his work on neutron stars and gravitational collapse. In 1939, working with his student George Folkoff, he explored the physics of extremely dense stellar objects, calculating the maximum mass a neutron star could have before collapsing under its own gravity. Then, with another student, Hartland Snyder, he took the next step and examined what would happen if a star exceeded that limit. The answer was stunning. The star would undergo indefinite gravitational collapse, shrinking to a point from which not even light could escape. They had predicted what would later be called a black hole, though that term would not be coined for another 30 years. It was pioneering work, decades ahead of its time, touching on some of the deepest mysteries of gravity and space-time. But the paper was published just as World War II was beginning, and nobody paid much attention to it. The physics community had more urgent concerns than exotic stellar objects. It would take decades before the importance of Oppenheimer's work on gravitational collapse was recognized. There is something haunting about this timing. Oppenheimer's greatest contribution to pure physics, the work that would have secured his place in the history of science, even without the atomic bomb, appeared just as his life was about to be transformed by very different kinds of concerns. He had been peering into the darkest corners of the universe, exploring what happens when gravity becomes so strong that nothing can resist it, when matter collapses into a point of infinite density. He was studying objects so extreme that they seemed almost like science fiction. And then, within a few years, he would be applying his talents to creating weapons of unprecedented destruction, devices that would kill hundreds of thousands of people and make possible the extinction of humanity itself. Was there a connection? Did the physicist who imagined black holes, who understood gravitational collapse in its most extreme form, have some intuition about the other kind of collapse, the collapse of moral certainty, the fall into darkness that the atomic bomb would represent? Or is this just hindsight, imposing patterns where none existed? What is certain is that by the end of the 1930s, Oppenheimer had built something significant, a thriving school of theoretical physics, a reputation as one of America's leading scientists, a network of brilliant students and colleagues. He had created a community, a place where he belonged not as an outsider, but as a leader. The loneliness of his childhood had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into something more bearable. He was still isolated in some ways, still lacking the intimate connections that might have sustained him emotionally. But he had purpose and recognition and a role to play. And then came fission, and everything changed. December 1938. In Berlin, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann performed an experiment that would change the world. They bombarded uranium with neutrons and found, to their astonishment, that the uranium atoms had split apart. They had achieved nuclear fission, though they did not immediately understand what they had done. It took Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch, working in exile because they were Jewish, to explain the physics of what had happened and to recognize its implications. News of the discovery spread rapidly through the physics community. In January 1939, Niels Bohr brought word of the discovery to America, and physicists immediately began to grasp what it meant. If you could split a uranium atom and release energy, and if that process released neutrons that could split other uranium atoms, you might have a chain reaction, and if you had a chain reaction, you might be able to release enormous amounts of energy in a very short time. You might, in other words, be able to build a bomb unlike anything the world had ever seen. Oppenheimer's initial reaction was skeptical. He had spent his career thinking about theoretical physics, about the fundamental nature of reality. The idea of turning these abstract concepts into weapons seemed almost vulgar, a betrayal of the purity of scientific inquiry. And practically speaking, he doubted whether it could be done. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. The amount of uranium required seemed impossibly large. The whole enterprise seemed more like science fiction than serious science. But he could not ignore it. None of the physicists could ignore it. By 1939, the world was sliding toward war. Hitler had occupied Czechoslovakia, would soon invade Poland. The possibility that Nazi Germany might develop atomic weapons was terrifying. Many of the scientists working on fission were refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria. They understood better than anyone what Hitler was capable of, what it would mean if he acquired such power. Albert Einstein, at the urging of Leo Szilard and other refugee physicists, wrote his famous letter to President Roosevelt, warning of the possibility of atomic bombs and urging that America begin its own research program. Oppenheimer began to pay attention. He attended conferences on fission, read the papers being published, talked with his colleagues about the possibilities. His skepticism began to erode as it became clear that the technical problems, while formidable, might be solvable. By 1941, with America's entry into the war after Pearl Harbor, the question was no longer whether atomic weapons were possible, but how quickly they could be developed. The Manhattan Project began to take shape in 1942. It would be an enormous undertaking, requiring industrial facilities across the country, employing tens of thousands of people, costing billions of dollars. The scientific leadership was crucial. They needed the best physicists, chemists, and engineers, and they needed them organized in a way that would allow rapid progress while maintaining absolute secrecy. General Leslie Groves was put in charge of the overall project. He was a military man, practical and determined, with no patience for scientific debate or academic sensibilities. He needed someone to run the scientific side, someone who could coordinate the theoretical and experimental work, someone who could communicate with the scientists and the military brass. He needed someone brilliant enough to command respect from the physicists, but practical enough to focus on results. He chose J. Robert Oppenheimer. The choice was controversial. Oppenheimer had never run a large organization, had no experience managing complex projects. His communist associations and those of his family and friends made him a security risk. The FBI had a thick file on him, documenting his attendance at leftist meetings, his relationships with Communist Party members, his financial contributions to various causes. Many thought he should not be given a security clearance, let alone put in charge of the most secret project in American history. But Groves saw something in him. Perhaps it was Oppenheimer's ability to see the big picture, to understand how all the different pieces of the project fit together. Perhaps it was his charisma, his ability to inspire others. Perhaps it was simply that there was no one else who combined the necessary scientific knowledge with the leadership abilities the job required. Whatever the reason, Groves backed him, overruling the security concerns and making him director of the secret laboratory that would be built at Los Alamos. Los Alamos. Of course, it would be in New Mexico, in the mountains not far from where Oppenheimer had found his brief happiness in the summer of 1922. The site had been a boys' ranch school, isolated and beautiful, perfect for a secret facility. They took it over, began construction, transformed it from a quiet school into a sprawling city, devoted to a single purpose, designing and building atomic bombs. Oppenheimer threw himself into the work with an intensity that amazed everyone who worked with him. He seemed to be everywhere at once, attending meetings on theoretical physics and engineering problems and security issues, mediating disputes between scientists, explaining complex technical matters to military officers, making decisions about everything from the fundamental design of the weapons to the layout of the housing for the scientists' families. The scientists who came to Los Alamos were the best in the world. Many of them had been Oppenheimer's students or colleagues. They came because the work was important, because defeating Hitler was essential, because they trusted Oppenheimer's leadership. But they also came with questions, with concerns, with the beginning of the moral unease that would haunt many of them later. Los Alamos quickly grew from a small laboratory into a large secret city. Housing had to be built, laboratories equipped, security established. The work was compartmentalized. Scientists working on one aspect of the bomb often did not know what others were doing. This was necessary for security, but frustrating for people accustomed to the free exchange of ideas that characterized scientific work. Oppenheimer fought for as much openness as possible within the project, understanding that scientific progress required communication and collaboration. But the security concerns were real. The Soviet Union, America's ally against Hitler, was also running an extensive espionage operation aimed at stealing atomic secrets. Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist working at Los Alamos, was passing information to Soviet agents. though this would not be discovered until after the war. Theodore Hall, a young American physicist, was also spying for the Soviets. There were others, and the security services suspected even more. The paranoia was intense, the surveillance constant. And Oppenheimer himself was under particular scrutiny. His past left-wing associations made him suspect. His continued friendship with former communists, his wife's radical background, his brother's open communist sympathies. All of this was documented, analyzed, worried over. The Chevalier affair became a particular focus. Hakon Chevalier, an old friend, had approached Oppenheimer in 1943 with what seemed to be a Soviet espionage request, asking if Oppenheimer would be willing to share atomic secrets. Oppenheimer refused, but he did not report the contact immediately, and when he finally did report it, his story kept changing. He tried to protect Chevalier, invented details to mislead the security services, and generally handled the whole thing in a way that raised more questions than it answered. This would haunt him. The evasions, the lies, the apparent attempt to shield someone who might have been working for the Soviets. It all looked terrible, even though there was no evidence that Oppenheimer himself had ever passed secrets or even seriously considered doing so. Groves and Lansdale, the chief security officer, chose to trust him, to believe that whatever his past associations, he was loyal to the project and to the country. But they documented everything, created a record that would later be used against him. Through it all, Oppenheimer kept working. The technical challenges were enormous. 2 different designs were being pursued: a gun assembly method for uranium and an implosion method for plutonium. The gun design was relatively straightforward. You would shoot one piece of uranium-235 into another piece, creating a critical mass that would undergo explosive fission. But getting enough uranium-235 was incredibly difficult, requiring massive enrichment facilities. The plutonium bomb was more complicated. Plutonium-239 could be produced in nuclear reactors, which was easier than enriching uranium. But plutonium could not be used in a gun design because it fissioned too quickly. The pieces would start to react before they were fully assembled, producing a fizzle rather than an explosion. The solution was implosion. Surround a sphere of plutonium with conventional explosives, detonate them simultaneously, and compress the plutonium so rapidly that it reaches critical mass and explodes before it can blow itself apart. The implosion design required extraordinary precision. The explosives had to detonate within microseconds of each other all around the sphere, creating a perfectly symmetrical compression wave. Early experiments were discouraging. The compressions were asymmetric. The plutonium squirted out the sides instead of being compressed. It seemed like it might not work at all. John von Neumann, the brilliant mathematician, suggested using shaped charges to focus the explosive energy. This helped, but enormous work remained. Oppenheimer recruited additional chemists and ordnance experts, reorganized the project to focus more resources on implosion. The Fat Man bomb design gradually emerged from countless experiments and calculations and failed attempts. Meanwhile, the uranium bomb, Little Boy, progressed more slowly but more steadily. The physics was understood, the engineering was straightforward, if expensive. By early 1945, it was clear that they would have enough enriched uranium for one bomb, and that it would probably work. But the plutonium bomb required a test. There were too many uncertainties, too many things that could go wrong. So they prepared for Trinity, the first nuclear explosion, scheduled for July 16th, 1945, in the desert of southern New Mexico. As the test approached, Oppenheimer's burden grew heavier. He understood what they were building better than anyone. Not just the physics, not just the engineering, but what it meant. He had read the estimates of how many people would die into the initial blast. How many more from fires and radiation? He knew that if the bomb worked as designed, it would kill tens of thousands in seconds. He knew that this was necessary, or at least everyone kept saying it was necessary, that it would end the war and save lives in the long run. But he also knew that they were creating something unprecedented, something that would change warfare forever, that would make possible the destruction of entire cities, entire countries, perhaps even human civilization itself. He was not naive about any of this. He had made his choices with open eyes. But choices made at a distance are different from choices about to be realized. As Trinity approached, as the bomb was assembled and placed on its tower in the desert, the abstract became concrete. They were really going to do this. They were really going to unleash this power. The night before the test, he barely slept. He walked the desert, checking preparations, talking with the scientists, trying to calculate one more time whether there was any chance of an unexpected disaster. Could the atmosphere itself ignite in a chain reaction? The calculations said no, but could they be certain? He was responsible. If something went wrong, if the bomb failed or succeeded in some catastrophic way, they had not anticipated it would be his failure, his responsibility. July 16th, 1945. Just before dawn, Oppenheimer and the other observers put on dark glasses and waited. The countdown proceeded. And then, at 5:29 in the morning, the desert turned to light. The explosion was more powerful than they had expected. A fireball rose into the sky, brighter than 1,000 suns. The shockwave rolled across the desert, rattling the observation points miles away. A mushroom cloud climbed into the stratosphere. And in that moment, Oppenheimer knew. They had succeeded. They had done what they set out to do. They had created a weapon of unprecedented power. Later, he would say that in that moment, he remembered words from the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu sacred text he had studied. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It was not pride in his voice when he recounted this, not satisfaction. It was horror and recognition, horror at what they had created, recognition that he had succeeded in his task, and that success meant he had helped create the means for destruction on a scale humanity had never before achieved. Some of the scientists cheered at the success. Others were silent, awed or frightened by what they had witnessed. But for Oppenheimer, the feeling was more complex. Relief that it had worked, that the years of effort had not been wasted. Pride in the scientific achievement. But underneath those surface emotions, something darker. The understanding that they had crossed a threshold, that the world would never be the same, that he personally bore responsibility for this transformation. 3 weeks later, Little Boy was loaded onto the Enola Gay and flown to Japan. On August 6, 1945, it was dropped on Hiroshima. 70,000 people died instantly, perhaps more. The city was obliterated in seconds. 3 days later, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. 40,000 more dead. The cities vanished in fire and radiation and wind. Oppenheimer was in Los Alamos when the news came. The bombs had worked as designed. The war would end. Japan would surrender within days. They had succeeded in their mission, had helped end the most destructive war in human history, had saved the lives of the American soldiers who would have been killed in an invasion of Japan. But the cost, the hundreds of thousands dead, the survivors with horrific burns and radiation sickness, the cities turned to ash. He had known this would happen, had known what the bombs would do. But knowing intellectually and experiencing the reality were different things. The weight of it settled on him in those days, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. The other scientists could share the burden among many shoulders. The military officers could say they were following orders. doing their duty. The politicians could claim necessity, could argue that it saved lives in the long run. All of this might be true. But Oppenheimer had been the coordinator, the leader, the one who made it possible. The responsibility was his, in a way it was no one else's. He had understood what they were building. He had understood it more completely than anyone else. And now he understood what they had done. And that understanding isolated him more profoundly than anything in his life before. Because no one else could fully grasp what he grasped. The complete picture, the physics and the engineering, and the politics and the death. All of it at once, all of it connected, all of it his. The loneliness of understanding, the isolation of carrying knowledge that no one else can fully grasp. This was his burden now, and it would never lift. The war ended. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The Manhattan Project was declared a spectacular success. The scientists who had worked at Los Alamos began to disperse, returning to their universities, resuming their interrupted careers. Some were celebrated as heroes who had helped win the war. Others tried to forget what they had done, to compartmentalize the experience and move on with their lives. But for all of them, something had changed. They had done something unprecedented, and the world would not let them forget it. For Oppenheimer, there was no escape, no return to normal life. He had become a public figure, the face of American science, the man who built the atomic bomb. He was invited to Washington to advise on atomic energy policy, to serve on committees, to help shape how the new technology would be controlled and managed. He accepted these responsibilities, perhaps hoping that by helping to control what he had created, he could somehow balance the scales, could ensure that atomic weapons would be used wisely, if at all. He became involved with the Acheson-Lilienthal Report, an attempt to create a plan for international control of atomic energy. The idea was beautiful in its simplicity. Place all atomic materials and facilities under international oversight. Prevent any nation from developing weapons in secret. Use atomic energy for peaceful purposes only. If it had worked, it might have prevented the arms race, might have created a different kind of world. But it did not work. The Soviet Union was already developing its own atomic weapons, using information stolen from Los Alamos and their own considerable scientific expertise. The Cold War was beginning. The wartime alliance between America and the Soviet Union dissolving into mutual suspicion and hostility. In this environment, the idea of sharing atomic secrets with an international body seemed naive, even dangerous. The American military wanted to maintain its nuclear monopoly as long as possible, wanted to develop more and better weapons, wanted to ensure American dominance in what was clearly becoming a new kind of conflict. Oppenheimer found himself increasingly at odds with those who advocated for aggressive nuclear weapons development. He believed in deterrence, in maintaining American security. But he also believed that there should be limits, that not every weapon that can be built should be built. He began to speak publicly about the dangers of nuclear weapons, about the responsibility that came with possessing them, about the need for international cooperation and arms control. This made him powerful enemies. Edward Teller, his former colleague at Los Alamos, was particularly adamant that America needed to develop the hydrogen bomb, a weapon potentially hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Teller believed that the Soviets would develop such a weapon and that America needed to develop it first. It was a matter of national survival, he argued. Oppenheimer was skeptical. The technical challenges of building a hydrogen bomb were enormous, and it was not clear that it could even be done. But more than that, he questioned whether such a weapon was necessary or wise. The atomic bomb was already powerful enough to destroy cities. Did humanity really need weapons that could destroy entire regions? Where did it end? What was the point of possessing weapons so powerful that using them would be tantamount to suicide? These were not just technical questions, they were moral questions. Questions about what kind of world we wanted to live in, what kind of future we were creating. And Oppenheimer, who understood the physics better than almost anyone, who had seen what atomic weapons could do, who carried the burden of having created them, felt compelled to raise these questions, even though doing so made him unpopular. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, years earlier than American officials had expected. The nuclear monopoly was over. The arms race had begun. In this new environment, the pressure to develop the hydrogen bomb became overwhelming. President Truman approved a crash program to develop it in January 1950. Oppenheimer did not actively oppose the program once the decision was made, but his earlier skepticism was remembered, his moral qualms were noted. He continued to serve on advisory committees, continued to offer his views on nuclear policy, but his influence was waning. Those who wanted unlimited weapons development saw him as an obstacle, as someone whose moral sensitivity was a liability in the hard realities of Cold War competition. His past associations came back to haunt him with renewed force. During the war, his communist connections had been overlooked because his services were essential. But now, in the atmosphere of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, those same associations were viewed much more seriously. His brother Frank had been a Communist Party member. He admitted this when questioned, and lost his academic position as a result. Kitty, Oppenheimer's wife, had been married to a communist who died fighting in Spain. John Totlock, his former lover, had been a party member. He himself had associated with communists throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. None of this was news. It was all documented in FBI files, had all been known during the war, but the interpretation had changed. During the war, he had been a loyal American doing essential work. Now, in the early 1950s, he was a security risk, someone whose loyalties were questionable, someone who might be passing secrets to the Soviet Union, or at least might be vulnerable to Soviet pressure. The fact that there was no evidence of any actual disloyalty did not matter. The suspicion was enough. The fact that he had raised questions about the hydrogen bomb had suggested that perhaps there should be limits on weapons development, was interpreted as proof that he was soft on communism, that he was more concerned with abstract moral principles than with American security. In 1953, Dwight Eisenhower became president, and his administration took a harder line. Lewis Strauss, a bitter enemy of Oppenheimer's, who had been humiliated by him in a congressional hearing years earlier, became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Strauss wanted revenge, wanted to destroy Oppenheimer's influence and reputation. He found willing allies among those who saw Oppenheimer as an obstacle to weapons development. In December 1953, Oppenheimer was informed that his security clearance was being suspended. A hearing would be held to determine whether it should be permanently revoked. The charges were numerous: his communist associations, his failure to report the Chevalier affair promptly, his opposition to the hydrogen bomb program, various allegations of disloyalty and unreliability. The hearing began in April 1954 and lasted for 3 weeks. It was held in a small room in Washington, but its implications were enormous. This was not just about one man's security clearance. It was about whether scientists who had moral qualms about weapons development would be allowed to influence policy. It was about whether the Cold War would be fought without limits or whether some space would be preserved for ethical considerations. The hearing was brutal. Oppenheimer's entire life was examined, his every action and association questioned. His friends and colleagues were called to testify, forced to choose between supporting him and maintaining their own careers and clearances. Some stood by him, spoke of his loyalty and his contributions to American science and security. Others, fearing for themselves, were less supportive. The most devastating testimony came from Edward Teller. When asked whether Oppenheimer was loyal, Teller would not give a clear answer. Instead, he said that he would feel safer if public matters were in other hands. It was not quite an accusation of disloyalty, but it was close enough. And coming from a fellow physicist, a former colleague, it carried enormous weight. The hearing stripped away Oppenheimer's public persona, exposed his private life, revealed his affairs and his lies and his evasions. The Chevalier affair was examined in excruciating detail. Why had he not reported it immediately? Why had his story changed? Was he protecting a spy? Was he himself involved in espionage? The fact that he had lied to security officers, even to protect a friend, even if he had no treasonous intent, was presented as evidence that he could not be trusted. His opposition to the hydrogen bomb was portrayed as evidence of disloyalty. How could a loyal American oppose developing a weapon that might ensure American security? The fact that his opposition had been based on technical and moral grounds, that other scientists shared his concerns, that he had accepted the decision once it was made, and had not actively sabotaged the program, none of this mattered. The fact that he had questioned at all was treated as suspicious. The verdict was predetermined. In June 1954, the hearing panel ruled that, while there was no evidence of disloyalty, Oppenheimer's security clearance should be revoked because of his fundamental defects in his character and his associations with communists. It was a careful formulation. They could not say he was disloyal because there was no evidence of that, but they could say he was unreliable, untrustworthy, a security risk. The practical effect was to end his influence on nuclear policy. He could no longer access classified information, could no longer advise the government on atomic weapons, could no longer participate in the debates about how nuclear technology should be developed and used. He had been the most influential scientist in America, and now he was cast aside, his warnings ignored, his counsel unwanted. The deeper effect was to send a message to other scientists. If you develop moral qualms about weapons development, if you question whether every possible weapon should be built, if you suggest that perhaps there should be limits, you will be destroyed. The message was received. The arms race proceeded without significant opposition from the scientific community. The thousands of nuclear weapons that Oppenheimer had feared were built, deployed, placed on hair trigger alert. For Oppenheimer personally, the hearing was devastating. His reputation was destroyed, his integrity questioned, his life's work reduced to a record of suspicion and alleged disloyalty. The man who had directed the Manhattan Project, who had made the atomic bomb possible, was now being treated as a security risk, as someone who could not be trusted with the secrets he himself had helped create. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was that he had been right. His concerns about the hydrogen bomb, his warnings about an unlimited arms race, his calls for international control of atomic weapons, these had all been dismissed as naive or even disloyal. But they had been prescient. The arms race did spin out of control. The superpowers did build tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, far more than could ever serve any rational military purpose. The world did come to the brink of nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, everything he had warned about came to pass. He had understood the implications of nuclear weapons more clearly than those who attacked him. He had seen where the path led, had tried to prevent the worst outcomes, and had been destroyed for his trouble. The loneliness of this, seeing clearly, speaking truthfully, being punished for both, was perhaps the deepest isolation of his life. He had been isolated as a child because he was different. He had been isolated in his brilliance because his mind moved faster than others could follow. He had been isolated by his understanding of what the atomic bomb meant. But this was a different kind of isolation. The isolation of being proven right too late, of having his warnings ignored and then vindicated when it was too late to matter. The destroyer of worlds, trying to save the world from what he had destroyed, and being cast out for the attempt. After the hearing, Oppenheimer withdrew. Not completely. He continued as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, continued to lecture occasionally, continued to write about the history and philosophy of science. But the vital connection to the work that had defined him, the ability to shape nuclear policy and influence the course of events he had set in motion, was gone. That door had closed, and it would never reopen. He was 50 years old in 1954, young enough that he might have rebuilt his career, might have made new contributions to physics. But something in him had broken during the hearing. The public exposure, the betrayal by former colleagues, the imputation that he was disloyal after everything he had done for his country. It had taken something essential from him. He continued going through the motions, but the fire that had driven him was diminished. He had time now to reflect, time that he had never had during the frantic years of building the bomb or the intense years of advising on policy. Time to think about what he had done, what it meant, what his life had amounted to. He gave lectures about science and culture, about the relationship between physics and philosophy, about what it meant to be a scientist in the modern world. His talks were eloquent, thoughtful, tinged with a melancholy that his audiences could sense, but perhaps not fully understand. What must it have been like, living with that knowledge? Waking each morning, knowing that you had helped create the weapon that killed hundreds of thousands, that had changed warfare forever, that had made possible the extinction of humanity itself, knowing that you had seen it clearly, had tried to prevent the worst outcomes, and had been cast aside and vilified for your trouble. The other Manhattan Project scientists could scatter, could return to their universities and their research, could compartmentalize what they had done during the war and move on with their lives. Some felt guilt, some felt pride, most felt a complicated mixture of both. But they could share the burden among many shoulders, could tell themselves that they were following orders or doing their duty, or that it had been necessary to defeat Hitler and end the war. But Oppenheimer had been the coordinator, the leader, the one who understood all the pieces and how they fit together. He could not compartmentalize in the same way. The responsibility was too personal, too complete. He had made it possible, and he had understood from the beginning what it would mean. There were honors, of course. In 1963, President Kennedy selected him for the Enola Gay Award, a small gesture of rehabilitation, meant to signal that the government no longer considered him a pariah. Lyndon Johnson actually presented the award after Kennedy's assassination. It was intended as recognition of his contributions to American science and security, an implicit acknowledgement that the security hearing had been unjust. But it was too little, too late. The award could not restore his security clearance, could not give back the years of influence he had lost, could not undo the damage to his reputation. By then, the world had moved on. The Cold War raged, the arms race continued. The superpowers had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization many times over. Everything Oppenheimer had feared in the early 1950s had come to pass. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 had brought humanity to the brink of nuclear war. For 13 days, the world held its breath as Kennedy and Khrushchev maneuvered and only luck and last-minute restraint prevented catastrophe. Oppenheimer watched all of this from the sidelines, no longer able to influence events. His warnings from a decade earlier, now vindicated but irrelevant. He had been right about where unlimited weapons development would lead. He had been right that there needed to be limits, that not every weapon that could be built should be built. But being right did not matter when no one in power was listening. His personal life in these final years was quiet, almost mundane after the drama of Los Alamos and the hearing. He and Kitty had 2 children, Peter and Tony, and he tried to be a father to them, though by all accounts he was not particularly successful at it. He had never learned how to have normal, intimate relationships, and parenthood did not come naturally to him. The emotional reserve that had protected him through so much difficulty also prevented him from fully connecting with his own children. He continued to read widely: poetry, philosophy, religious texts. He had always been drawn to the Bhagavad Gita, that ancient Sanskrit text about duty and destiny, and the terrible choices warriors must make. The line he had quoted after Trinity, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," came from that text. It was spoken by Krishna to the warrior Arjuna, who was reluctant to fight in a great battle because it would mean killing his own relatives and teachers. Krishna tells him that he must do his duty, that the battle must be fought regardless of his personal feelings. Did Oppenheimer see himself in Arjuna, a man forced by circumstances to do something terrible, to become death itself, because duty demanded it? Or did he identify more with Krishna, the God who understands the cosmic significance of actions, who sees the bigger picture that mortals cannot grasp? Perhaps he was both, the reluctant warrior and the cosmic observer, simultaneously engaged in the terrible work and aware of its full implications. He never expressed regret for his role in building the bomb, at least not publicly. When asked, he would say that it had been necessary to defeat Hitler, to end the war. He would say that given the same circumstances, he would make the same choices again. But there was always something in his voice, in his eyes, that suggested the answer was more complicated than that. He carried the weight of it visibly in his bearing, in the sadness that seemed to permeate his later years. Jean Tatlock, his former lover, had committed suicide in 1944. She had struggled with depression for years, and her death had affected him deeply. He had visited her not long before her death, and the FBI had surveillance photographs of the visit, which would be used against him at the hearing. But what must that visit have meant to him? A connection to his pre-war life, to the time before Los Alamos, before he became the destroyer of worlds. And then she was gone. Another loss. Another person who had known him before everything changed. His work on black holes, that great scientific achievement from 1939, gradually began to be recognized as astrophysicists developed the tools to study such extreme objects. By the 1960s, the physics community was rediscovering his papers with Volkoff and Snyder, realizing that Oppenheimer had anticipated by decades the understanding of gravitational collapse. Here was his greatest contribution to pure physics, finally receiving the recognition it deserved. But by then, he was defined entirely by the bomb. His scientific legacy had been overshadowed by his role in creating the weapon. There is a profound irony in this. Oppenheimer's best scientific work was about the most extreme consequences of gravity, about what happens when nothing can resist the pull toward infinite density, when matter collapses beyond any possibility of escape. And his life had followed a similar trajectory, pulled inexorably toward Los Alamos, toward the terrible responsibility of creating the bomb, unable to escape the gravity of that choice, collapsing under the weight of understanding what he had done and what it meant. In 1965, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He had been a heavy smoker for years, and the cancer was aggressive. He underwent treatment, but the prognosis was poor. He faced his illness with the same stoic reserve he had brought to everything else in his life. He did not complain, did not rage against the dying of the light. He simply grew thinner, weaker, more withdrawn. On February 18th, 1967, at 62 years old, J. Robert Oppenheimer died at his home in Princeton. The official cause was throat cancer, but one might say he died of caring too much for too long, of understanding too clearly, of being unable to escape the burden of what he had created. The obituaries noted his scientific achievements, his leadership of the Manhattan Project, his role in building the atomic bomb. Some mentioned the security hearing, the loss of his clearance, the controversy that had surrounded him in his final years. But none of them could fully capture what his life had been. The loneliness that had begun in childhood and deepened with every achievement, with every step closer to the center of history. He had been isolated by his brilliance, isolated by his understanding, isolated by his conscience. He had stood at the intersection of science and history and morality, seeing all the connections, bearing all the responsibility, unable to share the burden because no one else could fully grasp what he grasped. By the time of his death, the world had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 had banned atmospheric testing, a small step toward arms control. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Humanity possessed the means of its own destruction, and the knowledge of how to build these weapons could never be unlearned. Oppenheimer's bombs had opened a door that could never be closed. In his final years, students and colleagues who visited him at the Institute would sometimes ask him about Los Alamos, about the bomb, about whether he regretted it. He would deflect, would talk about duty and necessity, would say that the choices had been made in a different time under different circumstances. But occasionally, rarely, something else would slip through. A suggestion that if he had known then what he knew now, if he had understood fully what he was unleashing, he might have chosen differently. But how could he have known? How could anyone have known? The future is opaque, the consequences of our actions unpredictable. We make our choices with incomplete information, under pressure, trying to do what seems right or necessary in the moment. And then we live with the outcomes, watching as the choices we made ripple forward through time, creating consequences we never imagined, changing the world in ways we never intended. Oppenheimer understood this better than most. He had made his choice to build the bomb, to lead the project, to solve the scientific and engineering problems that made atomic weapons possible. And then he had spent the rest of his life watching the consequences unfold, powerless to control them, unable to undo what he had done. The final isolation was this: he could not even claim that he had been deceived, that he had not known what he was doing. He had known. From the beginning, he had understood what the bombs would do, had calculated the casualties, had recognized that this was a weapon unlike any other. He had done it anyway, because it seemed necessary, because Hitler had to be stopped, because he was the one who could do it, and therefore, he had to do it. And that knowledge, that he had chosen this, had done it with open eyes, had created the destroyer of worlds, not out of ignorance, but out of understanding. That was the burden he could never put down. He had not been tricked or misled. He had seen clearly and had done it anyway. And now he had to live with that clarity, with that understanding of what he had unleashed, unable to escape it even in death. There is a passage in the Bhagavad Gita, the text that Oppenheimer loved and returned to throughout his life. where Krishna reveals his cosmic form to Arjuna. Arjuna has been reluctant to fight in the great battle, troubled by the thought of killing his relatives and teachers. So Krishna shows him the truth, that he, Krishna, is time itself, the destroyer of worlds, and that all these warriors are already dead, already destroyed by the inexorable flow of cosmic destiny. Arjuna's choice to fight or not fight does not matter in this larger sense. The destruction will happen regardless. He is simply the instrument. Did Oppenheimer find comfort in this vision? Did he tell himself that he was simply an instrument? That the atomic bomb would have been built with or without him? That history was moving in a certain direction, and he was merely the one who happened to be there when it needed to be done? Perhaps. But there is a difference between being an instrument and being the coordinator, the leader, the one who makes it possible. Oppenheimer was not just one scientist among many working on the bomb. He was the director, the organizer, the person who brought all the pieces together and made them work. Without him, the Manhattan Project might have succeeded eventually, but it would have been slower, more chaotic, less efficient. His contribution was not just technical, it was leadership, vision, the ability to see how all the different aspects of the problem fit together. So he could not hide behind the excuse that he was simply following orders or doing what anyone would have done. He had chosen to take the job, chosen to lead the project, chosen to devote all his abilities to making atomic weapons a reality. He owned that choice and everything that followed from it. The question that haunted him, the question he could never fully answer, was whether it had been worth it. The bombs had ended the war. No one disputed that. Japan's surrender came days after Nagasaki, sparing the lives of soldiers on both sides who would have died in an invasion. By that calculus, the bombs were justified, even moral. Kill hundreds of thousands to save millions. But the calculation was never that simple. The bombs had not just ended one war. They had changed all future wars. They had made possible conflicts that could destroy civilization, that could render the earth uninhabitable. They had created a permanent threat, hanging over humanity like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. Was ending World War II worth creating the possibility of World War III? A war that might end human history? Oppenheimer had tried to address this question in the years after 1945. He had worked for international control of atomic energy, for arms limitations, for building in restraints and safeguards. He had tried to ensure that the weapons he created would be controlled, that they would not proliferate, that they would never be used again. And he had failed. The arms race had happened anyway. The weapons had proliferated anyway. The danger had grown anyway. So what had it all been for? What had his brilliance achieved? What had his sacrifice? And it was a sacrifice. The years at Los Alamos, the destruction of his reputation, the burden of guilt and responsibility. What had it all accomplished? He had helped America win the war. He had helped establish American military dominance in the early Cold War years. He had made contributions to science that would be recognized decades later. But he had also opened Pandora's box, releasing into the world a form of destruction that could never be contained, that would threaten every future generation. In his lectures and writings in the 1950s and 1960s, Oppenheimer often returned to the theme of science and responsibility. Scientists, he argued, were not just technical specialists. They were citizens, human beings with moral obligations. They had to think about the implications of their work, about how their discoveries would be used, about what kind of world they were creating. They could not hide behind claims of objectivity or value neutrality. Knowledge had consequences, and those who created knowledge had to reckon with those consequences. But even as he said these things, He must have been aware of the irony. He was the example, the cautionary tale. He was the scientist who had thought about responsibility, who had tried to grapple with the moral implications of his work, who had spoken out about the dangers of unlimited weapons development, and he had been destroyed for it. His security clearance revoked, his influence eliminated, his warnings ignored. So what lesson were younger scientists supposed to take from his example? That they should speak out about moral concerns and risk their careers? Or that they should keep their heads down, do the work they were assigned, and leave the moral questions to others? The tragedy was that Oppenheimer's fate discouraged precisely the kind of moral engagement he advocated. Other scientists saw what had happened to him and learned to be cautious, to keep their doubts private, to not question too loudly or too persistently. The message was clear. Brilliant scientists who develop moral qualms are security risks. Better to silence those qualms, or at least keep them to yourself. And so the arms race continued, driven by scientists who either believed in it or who kept their doubts to themselves. The hydrogen bomb was developed. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were deployed. Multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, allowing one missile to destroy multiple cities, were invented. The arsenals grew and grew, far beyond any rational military necessity. Driven by bureaucratic momentum and worst-case planning, and the fear that the other side might be ahead. All of this happened while Oppenheimer watched from Princeton. Unable to influence events, his expertise and experience wasted. The man who understood nuclear weapons better than almost anyone, who had thought deeply about their implications, who could have provided wise counsel about how to manage them, that man was shut out, deemed too unreliable to be trusted with the secrets he himself had helped create. There is a special cruelty in being silenced when you have something important to say, in knowing that your experience and understanding are needed, but being prevented from sharing them, in watching mistakes being made that you could help avoid, but being powerless to intervene. This was Oppenheimer's situation after 1954, and it must have been maddening. But perhaps there was also something inevitable about it. The destroyer of worlds could not be allowed to express regret, to suggest that perhaps the destruction had gone too far, that perhaps there should be limits. The logic of the Cold War required absolute commitment, unquestioning loyalty, certainty that more weapons meant more security. Someone like Oppenheimer, who understood that the reality was more complicated, that more weapons might actually mean less security, that there were paradoxes and dangers that simple-minded deterrence theory ignored. Someone like that was dangerous precisely because he understood too much. In his final years, as the cancer ate away at his body, Oppenheimer must have reflected on all of this. The choices he had made, the consequences that had followed, the burden he had carried. Did he regret it? Would he have chosen differently if he could go back? He never said, not directly. But there are hints, suggestions in his later writings and lectures. A weariness with the arms race, a sense that something had gone terribly wrong, that the hope of controlling atomic weapons had been naive. A sadness about the world his generation had created, about the permanent threat they had established. And perhaps a deeper regret, one he could never quite articulate. Not regret for building the bombs, that had been necessary, or at least defensible, but regret for what came after. Regret that his warnings had been ignored, that his attempt to impose some moral framework on nuclear weapons had failed, that the world had chosen the path of unlimited weapons development despite his objections. He had tried to be responsible for what he created. He had not built the bombs and then walked away, disclaiming any further connection to them. He had stayed engaged, had tried to shape policy, had tried to ensure that the weapons would be controlled and limited, and he had been punished for that attempt at responsibility. cast out as a security risk, his influence destroyed. The loneliness of this final period was perhaps the most profound of his life. He had been isolated in childhood because he was different, isolated by his brilliance because his mind worked differently, isolated by his understanding of what the bomb meant. But in these final years, he was isolated by history itself, by having been at the center of the most significant event of his century, and now being forced to watch from the margins as the consequences unfolded. He had succeeded in his great task. The bombs had worked, the war had ended. But success had brought only a heavier burden, a deeper isolation, a more profound loneliness. Because he had to live with what he had done, had to watch the world he had helped create, had to carry the knowledge of what atomic weapons meant and what they could do. And that knowledge, that understanding, separated him from almost everyone around him. Most people could think about nuclear weapons in the abstract, as political tools, as military assets, as symbols of national power. But Oppenheimer had seen the Trinity Test. He had watched the desert turn to light, had felt the shockwave, had seen the mushroom cloud rise. He had seen the photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The shadows burned into walls, the survivors with their melted skin, the cities reduced to ash. He knew in a visceral, immediate way what these weapons did. He could not think about them abstractly. And so when others talk casually about nuclear strategy, about acceptable casualties, about winning a nuclear war, he felt a horror they could not share. Because they did not understand. They had not seen what he had seen, had not felt what he had felt, did not carry what he carried. This was the final, deepest loneliness. The loneliness of bearing witness, of having seen something that cannot be unseen, of understanding something that cannot be unknown, of being unable to communicate the full horror of what you understand because the understanding itself comes from experience that others do not share. He died carrying this burden, this knowledge, this isolation. The man who had been at the center of history, who had coordinated the greatest scientific project of his age, who had created the destroyer of worlds, died alone in his understanding, unable to share the weight, unable to make others see what he saw. After Oppenheimer's death, the world continued its course. The arms race went on, the weapons proliferated, the danger grew. The Cold War eventually ended. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the threat of immediate nuclear annihilation receded somewhat. But the weapons remained, thousands of them, and the knowledge of how to build them spread to more and more nations. The genie Oppenheimer had helped release from the bottle could never be put back. His scientific legacy was complicated. His work on black holes was recognized as pioneering, and as astrophysics advanced, his insights were vindicated. But he had never won a Nobel Prize, and his reputation as a physicist was always overshadowed by his role in creating the bomb. He was remembered not for his contributions to understanding the universe, but for his contributions to humanity's capacity for self-destruction. The Manhattan Project itself became legendary, mythologized as a triumph of American scientific and engineering prowess. The story was told again and again, how the best minds in physics were assembled in secret, how they solved unprecedented problems, how they built a weapon that changed history. It was a story of success, of brilliance under pressure, of defeating tyranny through scientific innovation. But this triumphalist narrative missed something essential. It missed the moral complexity, the burden of responsibility, the cost paid by those who did the work. It especially missed what Oppenheimer had experienced, the progression from intellectual challenge to moral crisis, from scientific achievement to existential dread. In the decades after his death, As more information about the Manhattan Project became public, a more nuanced understanding began to emerge. Historians examined the decision to use the bombs on Japan, debated whether it had been necessary, whether alternatives had been available. Some argued that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, that the bombs had been unnecessary, even that they had been used primarily to intimidate the Soviet Union rather than to defeat Japan. Oppenheimer could not participate in these debates, but his presence haunted them. His famous quote about becoming death cast a shadow over all discussions of the bomb. Here was the man who built it, and even he seemed to be expressing horror at what he had done. What did that say about the decision to use it? What did it say about the world the bombs had created? The security hearing also took on new significance in retrospect. As the hysteria of McCarthyism faded, as the excesses of the Red Scare were recognized and regretted, Oppenheimer came to be seen as a victim, a brilliant scientist destroyed by political paranoia. In 2022, more than 50 years after his death, the Department of Energy formally vacated the decision to revoke his security clearance, acknowledging that the hearing had been flawed and unjust. But the vindication came far too late to matter to Oppenheimer himself. He had lived with the stigma, had suffered the isolation of being cast out, had died without seeing his reputation fully restored. The recognition that he had been treated unjustly was gratifying to his defenders, but meaningless to him. What would he have made of the world that emerged after his death? The end of the Cold War, the reduction in nuclear arsenals, the survival of humanity despite decades of living under the shadow of possible annihilation? Would he have felt relief that the worst had not happened, that the Cuban Missile Crisis and other close calls had not escalated into full nuclear war? Or would he have remained troubled by the fact that the weapons still existed? That the danger was only diminished but not eliminated? That future generations would have to live with the threat he had helped create? There is no way to know. But based on his writings and statements during his life, it seems likely that he would have maintained his fundamental position, that nuclear weapons were a necessary evil in an imperfect world, but that every effort should be made to control them, limit them, and ultimately eliminate them. That nations needed to find ways to resolve conflicts without resorting to weapons that could destroy civilization. That humanity had to grow beyond the cycle of arms, races, and wars of annihilation. These were not naive positions. Oppenheimer was not a pacifist, not someone who believed that all conflict could be resolved through dialogue and good intentions. He had lived through World War II, had seen the evil of Nazism, understood that sometimes force was necessary. But he also understood that nuclear weapons represented a qualitative change, that they were not just bigger conventional weapons, but something fundamentally different, requiring a different kind of thinking about security and conflict. The tragedy is that this nuanced, sophisticated understanding was largely ignored. The Cold War was fought with a simpler logic. We need more weapons than they have. We need better weapons than they have. We need to maintain our advantage at all costs. The kind of moral complexity Oppenheimer represented was seen as weakness, as dangerous sentimentality that could get people killed. And so his voice was silenced, his influence eliminated, his warnings dismissed, and the world he had feared came into being. A world with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, with multiple nations possessing them, with complex command and control systems that increase the risk of accident or miscalculation, with enough destructive power to end human civilization many times over. But the worst did not happen. Humanity survived. The weapons were never used after Nagasaki. Through luck or wisdom or the grace of God, the world managed to avoid nuclear war despite numerous close calls. The deterrence that Oppenheimer doubted but could not completely dismiss seemed to work. at least in the sense that the major nuclear powers never directly attacked each other. Does this vindicate the decisions that were made? Does it justify building the bombs, racing to develop the hydrogen bomb, accumulating vast arsenals? Or does it simply mean that humanity got lucky, that we narrowly avoided catastrophe, but easily could have gone the other way? Oppenheimer would probably have said that surviving so far is not the same as being safe, that the fact that the weapons have not been used yet does not mean they will never be used, that every year we possess these weapons is another year we risk using them. He would have pointed out that deterrence is not a stable long-term solution, that it only works as long as all parties remain rational, that it can fail catastrophically if even one person makes a mistake. But he also would have acknowledged the complexity, the lack of easy answers. He was not someone who dealt in simple certainties. His thinking about nuclear weapons was always marked by ambivalence, by an understanding that there were no perfect solutions, only difficult choices between imperfect alternatives. This ambivalence, this refusal to embrace simple answers, was part of what made him such an important figure. He represented a kind of moral seriousness that was rare in the Cold War era, a willingness to grapple with genuine ethical dilemmas, rather than taking refuge in ideology or political expediency. But it also contributed to his isolation. People are uncomfortable with ambivalence, with uncertainty, with moral complexity. They want leaders who are sure of themselves, who can tell them clearly what is right and what is wrong, who can provide certainty in an uncertain world. Oppenheimer could not do that. He understood too much, saw too many sides of every question, felt too deeply the weight of the choices that had to be made. And so he remained alone to the end, carrying his burden without being able to share it, understanding what others could not or would not understand, bearing witness to what he had done and what it meant. There is something almost universal about Oppenheimer's loneliness, something that transcends the specific circumstances of his life. Every person who has done something of great consequence, who has made choices that affect many others, who has been responsible for outcomes they could not fully control. Every such person knows something of what Oppenheimer experienced. The isolation of responsibility, the burden of consequences, the knowledge that your actions have rippled out into the world in ways you did not intend and cannot undo. But for Oppenheimer, this universal human experience was magnified to an almost unbearable degree, because his actions had not just affected a few people or even a few thousand. They had changed the trajectory of human history. They had created a permanent threat to human existence. They had made him, in a very real sense, the destroyer of worlds. And he had to live with that, had to wake up every morning knowing what he had done, had to read about the arms race and know that he had started it, had to watch the Cuban Missile Crisis and know that the weapons that nearly destroyed civilization were the offspring of the bombs he had built, had to die knowing that future generations would live under the shadow of nuclear annihilation because of choices he had made. This is the ultimate loneliness, the loneliness of having changed history, of bearing responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond your own life, of being unable to undo what you have done or escape what you have created. It is a loneliness that only a handful of people in human history have experienced, and Oppenheimer was one of them. In the end, his life traced a perfect arc of isolation, from the childhood loneliness of not belonging, through the intellectual isolation of brilliance that others could not match, through the moral isolation of understanding what the bomb meant, to the final political isolation of being cast out for his conscience. Each stage deepened the separation, intensified the solitude, made the burden heavier, and through it all, he remained essentially alone, unable to share what he knew, unable to make others understand what he understood, unable to escape the responsibility of what he had done. The loneliness of responsibility, deepening with each success, intensifying with each achievement, becoming absolute at the moment of his greatest triumph. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant child who never belonged, the physicist who saw further than others could follow, the destroyer of worlds who tried to save the world from what he had destroyed, the man who understood too much and was destroyed for his understanding. He died alone in his knowledge, carrying his burden to the grave, unable to put it down, even in death. And the world he helped create continues, still living under the shadow of the weapons he made possible, still threatened by the knowledge he helped unleash, still struggling with the questions he raised but could not answer. The loneliness of responsibility. It began before Los Alamos, intensified during the Manhattan Project, and became complete in the years after. From isolation to absolute isolation, each step taking him further from the possibility of being truly understood, truly known, truly met in the fullness of what he carried. This was his life. This was his burden. This was the price of being the one who understood, the one who made it possible, the one who could not escape the weight of what he had done. And in the end, he died as he had lived, brilliant, haunted, alone.